This is a very long question. I can tell you that perhaps most people know how we invited Stafford to Chile, and he arrived in November 71 and met a group of 12 people to discuss his ideas, and he came with a copy of his book, The Brain of the Firm, not published yet, but it was there, the draft, and brought the book for us. And that was, I think I'm not going to spend more time about that initial encounter with Stafford, where really I find it was very interesting in the end. In my early encounters with him was when we arranged to get Stafford into a beach 100 kilometers away from Santiago, Las Cruces. And in Las Cruces, in fact, I rented a house, which was the house of the main person from the city, from the, not city, town. And it was a nice little house where he was going to stay for a couple of months. And that was that's Las Cruces, June 1972. And very, very important thing for me, and to stay with him there. Perhaps one thing that I can tell you is that the first day I left him there, he went to walk on the rocks nearby the house, and when he turned his head back, he found that the house was in flames. So it was a very traumatic initial experience for him. So he rushed back to the house and found that there were nuns kneeling there, trying to avoid the curse of the communists, and then immediately the firemen arrived, and what they found was that the house was new, and that in the chimney where he was burning some logs to have something for the winter of Chile, they had not taken away the frame of the chimney. So he started the fire in the chimney, and it went up there and eventually got the frame, and that's what was coming out. So that was a very interesting initial state of our work together. At that point, he had several ideas in mind. And one of them was to develop a model of the economy for the future. And that was something that I could show you if we had the time for that. But no, I think I'm going to avoid going into the details of the model he developed. But one thing that was interesting there is he was using all the ideas of a requisite variety and mechanisms which were essential. And clearly that was where he started the book Designing Freedom. So the book Designing Freedom, it was a book that he started writing while he was in Las Cruces. And that was a book where he developed in some depth the strength of Ashby's requisite variety. And I think if you want to pin down his contribution, Stafford's contribution with the viable system, and it related to Ashby's law of requisite variety, that's the book. That's the book where you can, and I have the book as it was originally written, which, as perhaps you know, was written for the Canadians. Was written for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So, great book. Absolutely, I do advise you to read it again, because most people have read it, but to read it again, you will find it how powerful his understanding of society and requisite variety and mechanisms was at the time. And that was the book he wrote there. He wrote a number of other things as he was in Las Cruces, a model to understand society in the political sense as well. One thing that happened during that time was that in June 1972, he eventually realized that all the effort that had been done to have a sort of cybernetic modeling of the Chilean economy and the connections with the ideas of the operations room and all of that were perhaps a little bit far-fetched, and that what he had to do at that time was to start what we could call, and some people are calling these days, Cybersyn 2. So Cybersyn 1 was very much built up on the mechanisms and the technology of information management and operations rooms. And in fact, in Cybersyn 2, he wanted to go into the ideas of getting an influence on what Allende was doing in Chile. And he started to meet a number of other people while he was there. And that is something that eventually was extracted along this model that I mentioned, the model of the economy. And that was the second big thing that he produced in Las Cruces during that time. So that's the way, if you ask me, how did I come to know him, was essentially through the initial encounter in November 1971, but it was most significantly for me what happened in Las Cruces in June, July 1972. Stafford's, I think I somehow I introduced some of the ideas there, where I was saying clearly he had a view of the management of society with cybernetic principles, and that was what he made possible with the technology that he produced at the time. And we mentioned Guy von Siep, from the German guy who actually was responsible for the design of the operations room. Stafford did the design of the operations room in general terms with the support of his son Simon Beer, but the team that actually produced the actual diagrams that we have seen in the operations room were from that group in INTEC, the international, the technological and scientific company attached to Corfu, attached to the main proposer of Stafford's visit. Now, if you say what happened then, and I think that's interesting, he came back to England, and when he came back to England, and soon after that learned that a coup d'etat had happened, and that that was the end of the project in Chile at that time, he started to focus his mind in a number of papers and a number of writings he had been involved in for several years, but now he produced at that time Platform for Change, which was a very significant and important book of Stafford in 1975. But perhaps from my perspective, what happened at that time, he started to produce three books. One was The Heart of Enterprise in 1979. Two was The Brain of the Firm, second edition. And three was Managing Complexity with Cybernetics. These were three books that he produced from 1975 to 1985. And those books were absolutely a great contribution to cybernetics, organizational cybernetics. I think at that time, for me, it was important to have all these inputs from him because I learned a lot. I was learning huge amount from Stafford. In those days, I was very close to him in the process where he moved away from South London to Wales. And in Wales, where you were in the last few days, he found that house, which Corally Saf, which was very significant in the writings that I am talking about, and in a way was very important for me in creating a company, which I call Cinco Limited. Cinco was a company that was produced from Aston University, where I was at the time, and the first chairman of Cinco Limited was Stafford. So he became the first chairman. Very important to have someone of his prestige and capacity leading the company. Those were companies that were very, very interested in the outcomes of the three books that I mentioned earlier. And the result of that was that Cinco could do a number of projects there, which were very significant. However, and that is the point that I find particularly relevant, while people were very, very keen, very interested in information, and they thought that everything that Stafford was doing was essentially improving information management in their companies, eventually, when they started to hear and talk more about the books I mentioned, they became clear that information was not the most significant issue. That what was the most important and significant contribution of Stafford was about communications. And in communications is that they started to see that really they had better people inside their companies to do all the information management, because that was technology, but it was much more difficult to do things in the communications end, and that's where I think Cinco could help at that time. So important, the contribution that we produced at that time was, how is it that we can understand organizations as networks of communications, networks of systems, and that's the way that he started to have great influence. And the people who were attracted by all of that, they found him unbelievably relevant. So that's the way they continued contributing with him, and that's the way that eventually our work and his work got through some of organizations. Well, so what happened then, after all this period that I have just explained, what happened was that Stafford started to move into new ideas. And these new ideas were very much related to team's integrity. They started with the work of Buckminster Fuller, but he continued with the ideas of integration, and then team's integrity, which is the book that he produced in 1992-93. A very important contribution. Now, in that book, he develops, and I think you know very well, all the different forms of contribution of people to the improvement of networks of people. What happened then was that he started to recognize that really the problem was more the fact that people didn't understand the law of requisite variety properly. And the fact that they didn't understand requisite variety well, and they didn't understand it as a way of balancing varieties rather than trying to build up amplification and attenuation regardless of the purposes that people had, led him to write a paper which was very significant for me. And that paper was The World in Torment. The World in Torment in 1973 and December 1972 and 73 was a paper where eventually he started to connect all these ideas of cybernetics as information systems to ways of understanding how to deal with communications in groups. And that's where that paper has two things for me. One is that he actually explains and develops the principles of bad management that are common or were common at the time. And at the same time, he makes the connection with team's integrity. So that paper has the two aspects. The aspect of improving communications, but at the same time developing groups, and these groups were the ones that were eventually going to support improving processes inside organizations. And that's the world in torment, and a significant paper for the future. And at that point is that I also had a significant shift in my concerns. And I started to work with some people you know. Because in 1996, I had an invitation to go to Colombia. And that was a significant project where for 4 years, it was perhaps 1995, 96 to 1998, that we went to work with the Contraloría General de la República, to work with the Republic's auditing office, and it was there that I think, for me personally, that project was the beginning of seeing the problem in practice, not as theories, in practice, how to improve companies, how to improve organizations locally. And you know that because you supported us in all of that. And I think clearly that project for me was significant in shifting my grounds from information to communications and organizational systems. I think after that there were many things, but as we are approaching the year 2002, and therefore Stafford had the chance to communicate and contribute to the project in Colombia. He was there in Cartagena, and I think clearly his work had a profound influence in the people who were involved in that project. This is a very useful question for me, because one of the clear things that came to me is that this book, particularly the book The Failed State, by some Wainwright, or whatever the name is, the point is that that was at a time that clearly, and I had that conversation with Stafford in Borel-Isaf. I remember that he stayed. That conversation has stayed with me very deeply. He said to me, "The world is in problems. I don't think that people and governments are supporting well the development of the people and making it possible that for the longer term." And he was very strong, saying, "I don't see easily how to get better from there." Very important, because he was saying clearly people don't understand. He didn't perhaps use the same words that I'm using, but he didn't understand requisite variety, didn't understand respect, love, and all these aspects of what makes a society and an organization manageable. And he said, "I don't see things improving there. He was very clear that Great Britain was going down the drain. And that was a significant admission of Stafford, which influenced me very much. So what he would be doing today, and that's the reason our contribution to Metaforum in the meeting for this September, is precisely to talk more about how to improve societies, how to increase the capacity of people to use requisite variety and move in the direction of something that we could recognize as a way to improve societies in the future. First, I think I would describe him as an extraordinarily clever man, someone who could understand the world with great depth. And that's precisely the point that I was making last there. His capacity to see that things were not working well when they were absolutely essential. He had that capacity. He had that possibility to do. And that's perhaps what has remained with me as the most significant thing.